Muslim believers claim that the Quran is absolutely free from scientific errors. There is not one scientific mistake in the book. And whenever they are presented with any clear scientific mistake in the Quran, they find creative ways to construct apologetic arguments to refute that claim. So the underlying question is, are Muslim believers really in absolute denial of what is crystal clear? Or do they really have a sound and logical counter-argument that the Quran is truly free from scientific errors? In today's video, I want to introduce you to one of those exhausted and long debated scientific errors in the Quran. But more importantly, I want to explore the counter-arguments presented by Muslim apologists and explain why these defensive arguments do not refute or debunk the original claim. That is, that there are scientific errors in the Quran. Do you want to bury your head in the sand and continue with your faith? Well, that is your choice. But if you really want to pursue the truth, no matter where it takes you, then please keep watching. A very quick disclaimer though before I start. I absolutely support your right to believe in whatever you want to believe in, no matter how absurd or ridiculous it may seem in someone else's opinion. I stand for your religious freedom. But as an unbeliever myself, and while I fully support your freedom of belief, I also have the duty of promoting critical thinking and to protect freedom of speech. I stand for diversity and inclusion, and it is only through these values that we can coexist. With that in mind, let's delve in. So, what is that clear scientific error in the Quran? Well, you probably heard it before. As I said, it has been a long debated topic, and there are plenty of apologetic explanations from Muslim scholars and apologists against it. The Quran details the story of a person or a character mentioned as Dhul Qarnayn in Surah 18. In verse 86 of that surah, the Quran tells us that Dhul Qarnayn, or the two-horned one, reached the place of sunset. And right there, he found the sun to be setting in muddy waters or a murky pool. A non-believer like myself would normally look at this passage and see that the Quran clearly fell into a massive scientific error, since we all know that 1. You can never reach the place of sunset, for it is forever setting somewhere due to the Earth's constant rotation around the sun, and 2. Of course the sun doesn't set or go into muddy waters at the edge of the earth. At this point, if you are Muslim watching me, you could do a facepalm and say, "Oh my God, still some silly non-believers making this argument." The Quran didn't say the sun set in muddy waters. It says وَجَدَهَا, meaning it appeared to Dhul Qarnayn that it sets in muddy water. The word wajada could mean appeared to, or looked like it was setting in a muddy pool. Okay, alright. I hear what you're saying. You claim that the Quran doesn't say it sets in muddy waters. The Quran says Dhul Qarnayn found it to be setting in muddy waters. Thus you conclude that the Quran is true and didn't fall into any scientific error. I hear you. Can you hear me now? Will you let me explain why this apologetic response doesn't seem to do it for me? It doesn't sound convincing at all. Let me tell you why, if you really care about the truth and not just protecting your beliefs for the sake of it. Will you? There are 3 reasons, not just one, 3 reasons why this explanation falls short to defend your faith-based position. The first reason is Muslim scholars have an important rule in tafsir, or interpreting the Quran. The rule of thumb in understanding the meaning of any word in the Quran is by referring to the Quran itself. Al-Quran yufassar bil-Quran. literally means the Quran is interpreted by the Quran. So if we want to really understand the meaning of the word wajadaha in this verse, we need to look at how the word was used and how it was meant in the rest of the story. Luckily for us, we don't need to look too far to find the same word repeated multiple times, for the word wajada was used twice in the same verse and 4 times in the story of Dhul Qarnayn. When you read verse 86 fully from the start to finish, you will see how the translators of the Quran deliberately forged the translation of the word wajada. The first time in the verse, the word wajada was translated as appeared to him, while the second time in the same verse it was translated as found. He literally found something. حتى إذا بلغ مغرب الشمس وجدها ووجد عندها قوما, until he reached the setting point of the sun, which appeared to him وجدها, to be setting in a spring of murky waters, where he found wajada, found some people. This is the very same word in the very same verse, yet translated differently, simply because the second wajada in the same verse cannot mean it appeared to him that there were some people. No, he actually found some people in that place. More interestingly, just 4 verses later, Dhul Qarnayn encounters the sunrise, this time in verse 90. Almost identical wording to verse 86. Have a look on the screen. حتى إذا بلغ مطلع الشمس وجدها. This time the word وجدها was translated as he found it rising on people. Not it appeared to him to be rising on people. No, he literally found it rising on people. And again, 2 verses later, verse 93, Dhul Qarnayn reached a 3rd place. And وَجَدَ مِن دُونِهِمَ قَوْمًا. He found in front of them some people. Every single wajada in the Quran means found or found out. In fact, in the entire Quran, the word wajada with all its variations appeared 40 times. Every one of these except that one was translated as found or found out, never meant or translated as appeared to be. That's because the coherent use of the word wajada in the Quran means found, not appeared to be. To prove my point, when the Quran wanted to say something appeared to be while not really happening, it used a different word. When the Quran was telling the story of Moses and Pharaoh's magicians, in Surah number 20 verse 66, it said, "And suddenly the ropes and staffs appeared to him as if by magic to be slithering." The word translated appeared to him is يُخَيَّلُ إِلَيْهِ. This word translated as appeared to him is يُخَيَّلُ إِلَيْهِ, not wajada. That's because خُيِّلَ إِلَيْهِ or يُخَيَّلُ إِلَيْهِ means appears or appeared to be when it is not really happening that way, while wajada means found something to be in real life as is. That's how coherent the Quran is in its usage of words and its meanings. Now, you coming today or any Muslim apologist trying to convince me that this one time the word wajada was used out of 40 other times, this one time, in this instance, the Quran meant the sun appeared to Dhul Qarnayn to be setting in muddy pool, but the Quran doesn't really mean that the sun sets in a muddy pool. That explanation is utter nonsense and doesn't even match the rest of the Quran itself or its linguistic coherence. That was my first reason. Now, the second reason this apologetic response falls short is that it completely ignores the history of civilizations and mythology. In the Greek mythology, which a lot of people will argue that Dhul Qarnayn came from and that it is an alias for Alexander the Great. But beside that point, in the Greek mythology, we find that the sun god, Helios, pulling the sun with his chariot every day in the sky, all the way from the east to the west, where he goes into Oceanus or Oceanus, a massive body of water that wraps around the flat disk of the earth, where he goes back to the east to pull the sun again from the east to the west on the next day. In some stories, there is a muddy and dark beach at the far ends of the earth where the sun goes down into the underworld. Similarly, the ancient Egyptians believed that the sun goes down to the underworld at night. You wonder how? Ra, the sun god of ancient Egypt, used 2 boats or sailing ships. At night, Ra takes the musketet or the evening boat on his journey to the Duat, the 12 hours of night, which also is the literal meaning of the underworld in ancient Egypt. So between the Egyptian Ra, who sails on a solar boat, and the Greek Helios, who pulls the sun towards a massive body of water known as Oceanus, it doesn't come as a surprise at all to find the author of the Quran following the mythical trend of his time, telling us in the Quran that the sun also sets in a muddy pool. Perhaps a muddy pool like that muddy beach at the end of Oceanus leading to the underworld? But in the Islamic version, it goes and bows down or kneels before Allah. So again, you coming today trying to twist the meaning of one word in the Quran to make it sound like it only just appeared to Dhul Qarnayn. But you know what? The Quran didn't really mean that the sun sets in a muddy pool. Well, that sounds really like a weak argument to me, and honestly, not convincing at all. It seems that the Quran reiterated what a lot of people already believed at the time. The third and final reason as to why this apologetic response doesn't have any merit is that the Sunnah also confirms that the sun indeed sets in a muddy pool. And we are not talking about a disputed hadith. We are talking about authentic hadith, hadith sahih. Now, you probably heard this hadith before, narrated by Abu Dharr. I was sitting behind the Messenger of Allah who was riding on a donkey while the sun was setting. He asked, "Do you know where this sets?" I replied, "Allah and His Apostle know best." He said, "It sets in a spring of warm water." Of course, some Muslim apologists will claim that this particular narration is disputed and cannot be taken as evidence against the Quran. And while I disagree with the apologetic response that this hadith cannot be used as an evidence, it requires an entire video to explain why it is still valid. But instead, let me show you how the Sunnah still agrees and confirms that the sun indeed sets in a muddy pool, and that the Sahaba and the early Muslims understood it that way. Early on, when Muslims were reading this verse number 86 in Surah Al-Kahf, there was a massive debate around the reading of the actual word. When Dhul Qarnayn saw the sun setting, did the Quran use the word hami'ah or hamiyah, muddy pool or hot pool of water? Now, Tafsir Ibn Kathir and also Tafsir Ad-Durr al-Manthur by Imam al-Sayuti tells us the stories surrounding that debate. In one particular story they both mention, Ibn Kathir and al-Sayuti, the debate was between 3 Muslim people known as Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, Ibn Abbas, and Abdullah ibn Amr. As they were arguing and debating about the word, is it hami'ah or hamiyah, they called for a 4th guy named Ka'b al-Ahbar to ask him his opinion. Now, the most interesting part is that Ka'b al-Ahbar was Muslim from a Jewish background. When they asked him about whether the sun sets in Ayn Hami'ah or Ayn Hamiyah, muddy pool or hot pool of water, they asked him a very interesting question. They said, "Hey Ka'b, since you are originally a Jew before you embraced Islam, where does the sun set in the Torah?" Which Ka'b then answered, "In the Torah, the sun sets in a pool of mud and water." Now, the reason this answer and the question are very interesting and intriguing is that it doesn't talk about Dhul Qarnayn at all. It talks about the actual place of sunset. "Hey Ka'b, What does the Torah say about the place of sunset? And Ka'b then confirms that the sun sets in a muddy pool, regardless of Dhul Qarnayn and his story. Ka'b is referring to a different book altogether, and it doesn't really matter if it says so in the Torah or not. That is irrelevant to the argument. It doesn't even matter if Ka'b is saying the truth from the Bible or not. Why doesn't it matter, you wonder? Simply because the Sahaba, Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, Ibn Abbas, and Abdullah ibn Amr, they were not trying to verify what Dhul Qarnayn saw or how he saw the sun setting. Instead, they asked, what does the Torah say about the place of sunset? Any answer after that doesn't matter. What really matters here from this story is that it shows us that the early Muslims and the Sahaba knew what the Quran meant. It wasn't the sun appeared to Dhul Qarnayn as if it sets in a muddy pool. No. The Quran meant the sun actually does set in a muddy pool like it was mentioned in the Torah. The place of the actual sunset. So, to wrap up and end this video, the apologetic response that the Quran is free from scientific errors and that it didn't fall in the same mistakes of the ancient mythology is a very weak argument and clearly an absurd claim. You can choose to ignore all the above, bury your head in the sand, and insist that the Quran is free from scientific mistakes. But for someone who values the sound of logic and reason, it is undeniable that the Quran fell into the same scientific errors of the ancients, and clearly the author was just a mere human from that ancient past.